So surprise leaked Necron rules today? It seems that there's a whole new way to play the army, a brutal looking destroyer cult, and some of the damage dealing stratagems and options look very nasty indeed. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons and going over a fairly extensive new rules package for the faction, particularly helpful if you did want to theme an army around a destroyer cult, and it does look like it's perfectly legal for match play. Basically, the new rule set is an Necron army of renown called an Annihilation Legion. It's from this month's White Dwarf, where the majority of people around the world don't happen to have theirs yet, but someone got their copy early and uploaded this to the internet. The formation kind of reminds me of the Crusher Stampede that we saw in the White Dwarf last year, an army of renown that seems to be entirely match play legal. This one's focusing on destroyers, and it does give some interesting and pretty cool damage buffs to the faction. I do find the timing of this kind of curious on the back of their no supplemental rules in campaign books thing. What they said in their stream the other week was that they didn't want to have people carrying around multiple different rule books with them when they were playing games, so they were going to try and keep the majority of rules in the codex, and then just a little bit of time later we have supplemental content coming out in White Dwarf. To be fair to them, I think that this might arguably be a better way of delivering the rules. If you wanted to buy the issue just literally for the Necron rules, the price is far more acceptable than something ridiculous like a £30 or $60 US campaign book. And I guess for carrying it around, it might not be too hard just to excise a few pages and have them just loose in the codex. I guess perhaps the main downside might be that they might go out of print, which could be kind of annoying if you didn't want the rules from an official source, but seeing as they've already been uploaded to the internet, I suspect they'd only be a quick Google search away at any point anyway. To be honest, I'm not really against the idea of supplemental content for codexes that much, but delivering it in very expensive rulebooks is a bit of a mess. And these rules do seem really quite fun and fluffy for Necron players, to be honest. I was kind of wondering if they were going to get the short end of the stick in terms of these supplemental rules and things. Maybe Games Workshop immediately deciding to cancel them before their Nephilim ones arrived. In fact, I do kind of wonder whether these supplemental Army of Renown type things might have been previously destined for expensive Warzone Nephilim campaign books. And what we're actually going to be seeing in White Dwarf is the same sort of rules content that would have been in those books, but distributed a bit cheaper across White Dwarf magazines. And if you do want the rules, then you could just pick up the ones that you want, I guess, or probably, as a lot of people do, just Google them. In any case, I'll be interested to hear your guys' take on whether or not this is a better way to distribute these supplements. Anyway though, let's get into the Annihilation Legion itself. The army is one of Games Workshop's armies of renown, ones where you're basically limited to a subset of units within the codex, but then they get a whole ton of expanded options and some other powerful buffs and things to make them a bit more viable on their own 2 feet. Maybe it should be own 3 feet where destroyers are concerned. As I mentioned, this particular one is basically representing a destroyer cult, perhaps not too unexpected given how many of them there are in the codex now. In terms of units that you can select, there's only destroyer cult ones, flayed ones, and plasmasides, so the bulk of your force might be made up of things like Scorpec destroyers, Ophidian destroyers, the 2 flavours of locust ones led by the lords, the Hexmark, and also the flayed ones in support. That is cutting out a whole bunch of options though, as we'll mention later, things like the Silent King, Cryptex, Lichguard, and a whole bunch of other good stuff, so it's definitely a big drawback in terms of options. You're also basically swapping out your dynastic code and command protocols. The dynastic code you get to essentially swap for a unique one called Cult of Annihilation, though the units do still seem to get their dynastic keyword, so you could maybe designate them as Novok for example to gain access to their stratagem and warlord traits and relics if you'd like, but on most units you wouldn't be getting the extra AP or anything. This one is worded just a little bit weirdly though. It doesn't seem to explicitly say that flayed ones don't get their dynastic code, only that the destroyer cult ones don't, so maybe the flayed ones might still retain it somehow, though this doesn't seem like it to be very intentional to me. Let me know what your guys' takes on that one are. If flayed ones do retain their dynastic code, then that could be quite powerful. You could give them one to make them OBSEC for example. Lastly, you trade out the command protocols. You don't get any of the standard ones, and you swap them out for the unique ones from this legion, though they do have the bad old wording though, to be honest, such as having to be next to nobles. These Annihilation Protocols really are quite nice though, and we'll get onto them in a second. Besides Annihilation Protocols, going down the list of benefits, the Vanguard detachment costs 0 CP if your warlord's in it, so basically refunds it in the same way that a battalion would. That one's quite a good start. Kind of incentivises you to build around a core of Scorpex and flayed ones. They do seem like the units that you might want on the front of the battle line anyway. You get a whole bunch of bonus rules, a single unique warlord trait, 3 unique relics, and then 8 Stratagems. The Stratagems are maybe the pick of the bunch here, there's a ton of good damage dealers. Next, Hexmark Destroyers become very easy to field, they become HQ choices, and for each Destroyer Lord that you have, you can include one of them slot free, so if you want 3 of them, it's really not that hard. And finally, besides those Annihilation Protocols, we also get the Cult of Annihilation, essentially Dynastic Code. This one's a little bit situational, but can be very powerful when it matters. Against units that are below their starting strength, you get +1 to hit, army-wide and range and melee, and if units are below half their strength, then they suddenly get +1 to wound as well. So any depleted enemy units are going to be super easy to finish off. As a trait, I'd say it's okay, but not super standout. Certainly seems far less useful than the commonly taken objective secured and pre-game move combo. Against some armies this will be kind of handy, maybe anything that's got fairly big tough units that you might be able to chip off one model and then really go to town on them. Against some armies it's going to be a bit underwhelming though, particularly anything with a whole bunch of vehicles. It won't do anything at all against knights, for example. I'd say this one is perhaps a nice to have, but maybe not the main draw of playing the army. On to other stuff though, and next we have character traits. I'd say the Warlord trait is pretty usable to be honest. Furious Destructor gives you 6s to hit, in melee get an extra 2 extra hits, kind of double exploding 6s in a similar sort of way to Tesla. On anything that hits on a 2+, that would usually equate to a 40% damage boost, which is pretty nice, and that goes up to a 50% if you're talking about things like the Scorpec Destroyer's great big hyperphase sword. That one's -1 to hit, so exploding 6s are even more meaningful. Maybe a little bit swingy in terms of damage output, but overall it seems like a pretty decent Warlord trait, I'd say particularly for the Scorpec Lord. Otherwise there's 3 different relics, maybe a section that the Necrons have struggled for a bit in the past. The Veil of Darkness is pretty good, but I feel a few of the others are a bit underwhelming. There's basically 1 each for the 3 takeable characters. The Chariot of the Hierarchs for the Locust Lord, that gives him transhuman physiology, wound rolls of 1 to 3 auto fail, plus a pylon and consolidate move of an extra 3 inches. I'd say that's maybe a bit take or leave, useful defensive buff, and the combat thing would be handy, perhaps not super standout though. I think the Nightcall side though again is pretty interesting on a Scorpec Lord, already a solid enough melee threat, particularly with that Warlord trait. The Nightcall side allows you to use the Hyperphase Harvester without the -1 to hit penalty. A solid enough boost in itself, but also means that you get the excess damage is not lost special rule, which basically means that if you're fighting something like infantry, every hit that he gets through with that big damage 3 weapon will suddenly become 3 dead models. Really quite nice whether you're fighting 2 wound Space Marines or 1 wound infantry, that does look like it could help him out quite a lot. It does make him pretty brutal against most infantry. On average, a guy with this plus that Warlord trait would average something around 14 1 wound infantry dead, provided their toughness 4 or less and have a 4+ or worse save. Really quite nice against Space Marines as well. I believe it'd equate to around about 7 of them dead due to the overspilling damage. I feel like that might well be enough to warrant building around. He does seem like a pretty brutal threat hidden within the ranks. Finally, for the Hexmark Destroyer, we have the Mask of Obliteration. Each turn you get to choose between swapping out those pistol attacks with a beam attack if you'd like to, a single shot at strength 9, AP 3 and damage D3+3, basically a single big anti-tank punch shot, and as with quite a few of Games Workshop's rules, if you manage to skewer 2 different units with it, you've got the potential to hit more than 1 squad with that same powerful shot. As Hexmarks are quite cheap anyway, I don't really think that this one's too bad to be honest. I feel like it actually might make the unit a bit more usable against the field rather than just certain armies. Currently Hexmarks are kind of great against anything with lots of infantry with bad saves, but pretty rubbish against Armour of Contempt or vehicle armies. This could make one far more threatening in the worst matchups for them, and make it less of a thing that your opponent can just ignore. Overall I'd say everything seems usable, probably the combo of the Warlord trait plus the Nightcall scythe on a Scorpec Lord looks the most exciting to me. That'd be a Necron that'd obliterate things pretty easily. Next up we've got Annihilation Protocols, basically a different version of command protocols that are unique to this army, and they do look rather powerful in terms of the buffs that they give. The biggest drawback with them is that they have the old style command protocols rule. We're back to the requirement of needing them to be near the nobles, the Locust Lord or the Scorpec Lord, and you just get one of these per turn rather than getting one that's all game long on top of the rest. I'd be aware that they only apply to the Destroyer cult units as well, so you don't get flayed ones with these advantages, but broadly speaking the ones on this list do look rather nice and really quite dangerous damage or defensive boosts, a lot more so than the standard command protocols. I don't know whether Games Workshop would FAQ this to be more in line with the standard ones, they do tend to have fairly poor support for anything that comes out in a White Dwarf supplement. It might well be that these just wind up being ones that just cluster around Scorpec or Locust Lords, but that still would allow you to apply them to a decent chunk of the army. It might just be a big incentive to have a Locust Lord, say, supporting a bunch of ranged destroyers, and a Scorpec one supporting the melee units pushing up the field. To go through them quickly, first up we have the Protocol of Swift Murder. The first one's absolutely great, with light cover if your unit's moved. That seems like a really nice one to have turn 1 if you happen to go first, and then move your units out into the open. Then it means that you've got a really nice defensive buff against being shot. The second part's Heroic Intervention for all units. That could be potentially nice once your forces do get stuck into the enemy. It could make them a bit harder to deal with, but it's kind of situational. Next is the Protocol of the Killing Surge. Plus 2-inch movement is great. The second one's fallback and charge, a bit more situational again. Again, the movement could be a very nice one to have either fairly early game or fairly late game. Early game to push units up the board fast, late game to try and sprint towards objectives and things. Fallback and charge is the other part, again certainly not useless, could be quite handy, though it might be a little bit more niche. Next we've got Protocol of the Dread Strike. The first one is 6s to hit in melee, auto wound. Bypassing the wound step is pretty nice with things like transhuman physiology around. Certainly helps you punch up against hard targets like knights and things. This one just generally seems like a very nice melee buff. Kind of sad that you don't get it on flayed ones who would absolutely love it, but still very good regardless. Otherwise, for the ranged destroyers, there's 6s to hit at range, get a +1 to wounds. Again, a pretty solid shooting buff there. I feel like this one could be a pretty reasonable one to have at some turns when you're going to be doing damage. Both of those rules are very nice. Next up, we've got the Protocol of Undying Gaze. The first one's ignore cover at half range. Not too bad on the Locusts, I suppose, but having to get close is a little bit annoying. And the second one is shoot while doing actions. I feel like that one's a little bit more niche maybe. I feel like you've got plenty of melee units that could be wandering around doing actions themselves without having to leave that up to the Locust destroyers. Next up, there's Protocol of Perfect Destruction. +1 to charge for the first one, handy enough, or a +3 inches to pile in or consolidate. The charge boost looks like it'd be a fun surge to get you into combat. I'm a bit less sold on the pile in and consolidate buff though. And finally there's Protocol of the Immortal Warrior, two very nice toughness buffs that you'd want at least somewhere in the list. The first one gives you +1 toughness, the second one gives you +1 to your saves. I think that would be a very strong one to have sometime mid-game when your units are likely to be taking damage. You can just look at your opponent's army and decide whether or not the first one or the second one will be better. I'm very impressed with that one though, does look like that one could be an easy pick. Out of the list I am pretty impressed though, a fair few of the command protocol ones just seem kind of edge case or not that big damage boosts. Out of this list I think Immortal Warrior might be my very favourite, but the extra movements, the light cover, the ranged and melee damage boost, all of those seem absolutely great. It looks like you'd have a very strong list going through the game. Lastly, and perhaps one of the best bits, are the list of stratagems. A lot of these are really quite brutal damage boosts, which isn't too bad to have. Kind of a shame that the Silent King can't be taken in these, as he brings a lot more command points with him, and makes CP pretty available to Necrons in general. First up we've got Swift Dismemberment, advance and charge for a Destroyer Cult unit. Really nice that one, gives you a much bigger charge threat range with things like Scorpex or Ophidians. I certainly wouldn't underestimate that one, that's a big win right out of the gate. Next for 1 CP we've got Hyperphase Impalement. An Amphidia Destroyer unit cuts through rules that ignore wounds, so you won't get things like Feel No Pain type saves or damage caps against their weapons. Obviously a bit more niche as not all units have those, but when you do encounter such a one, that'll be very nice. Could be a good one for say trying to get the jump and assassinating something like Abaddon, if the thing that was going to stop you killing him was going to be the damage cap. For 2 CP we've got Efficient Disintegration. Locust destroyers get a +1 damage with their Gauss weapons, and that applies to both the standard Locusts and the Heavies. Out of the two I think that's far more meaningful on the standard Locust destroyers with their regular Gauss cannons. Jumping them up to D3+1 damage is usually going to be a 50% damage increase against things that care. If you were feeling really spendy and wanted to have a devastating round of shooting, you could also combine that with the full reroll wounds roll things. Shooting like that is going to absolutely wreck a big heavy vehicle, particularly combined with their standard rerolls. For 1 or 2 CP there's Lurking Murderers, a situational buff to flayed ones, which when they're entirely within an area terrain feature, they get to reroll wound rolls in melee. 1 CP if there's 10 or less in the squad, or 2 CP if more. I think that's always going to be one to weigh up if you can trigger it, though being in area terrain isn't always going to happen, which does limit its scope a bit. For 2 CP there's Murderous Demise. You get to either shoot or fight in death with a character instead of any other on death rules, so you couldn't combine this with the Resurrection Protocols. The fighting rule only applies if you haven't fought already this phase, but still would be very nice if you hadn't. It does also mean that the opponent might well be risking things quite a bit by shooting down a Hexmount destroyer. Potentially they could ruin a fragile unit that was just about to inflict damage. That'd be an interesting one to have in the back pocket if they did say have the opportunity to wreck a fragile Eldar unit or something after they got killed. Next for 1 CP we've got Canoptech Reinforcement. This one allows you to basically regenerate a plasma site that's been killed. You set it up anywhere within 3 inches of a destroyer cult unit, and you can only use the stratagem once per game. They do seem like the sort of unit that you might accidentally lose from time to time, either by moving out of range of them, or just by having a fragile exposed one killed. As best I can tell from the wording of the rule, it looks like it would cost reinforcement points, but maybe it isn't the worst one to leave 15 points left over for. By getting one in the next turn, you could give some serious melee boosts to some Scorpec destroyers or something. I feel like this one could well be 1 CP well spent. For 2 CP, we've got Weaponized Bodies. This is a similar one to the Crusher Stampede Army of Renown one. Basically, a charging destroyer unit gets mortal wound impact hits. The wording's a bit complex, but still kind of intuitive really. For every model that is within engagement range of the enemy, you roll 1 dice based on the number of wounds that the destroyer model has. For every 5+, you deal a mortal wound up to a cap of 6. Say for example, if you had a unit of Scorpec destroyers, you managed to charge in and get 4 of them in engagement range, you'd be rolling 12 dice to try and get mortals on a 5+, should add up to an average of 4 mortal wounds for 2 CP. Maybe a little bit on the pricey side for 2 command points. I feel like you wouldn't always want to use this, but it could be quite a nice one if you can get a really big squad all in engagement range, and particularly so if the opponent's got a whole load of barriers to damage, maybe something like Be'lakor for example. Lastly, we've got a Moment of Clarity. This one again is fairly pricey at 2 CP, and it means that you gain Obsec on 1 unit in your command phase until the start of your next turn. I like the idea that basically the Mad Destroyer unit suddenly wakes up a bit and regains a bit of their sentience before falling back into the haze. A fairly useful one to have, to be honest, in an army with very limited obsec. You could just basically decide whether or not this will make the difference for an objective or not in the command phase, and decide whether or not you're willing to spend the CP for that privilege. It could easily be trading out 2 CP for 4 victory points, and that might well be worth it in a close game. Overall, I feel like the stratagem section of this update is a pretty beefy one, to be honest. Lots of good picks here, and they'll be competing with the other good destroyer ones, such as -1 to wound for the Scorpex, or the one that allows you to full reroll wound rerolls. That one's particularly nice on the Locust destroyers. I think out of these, the Advance and Charge is pretty standout. Efficient Disintegration, it looks pretty nice for the Locust destroyers. Sometimes that will be better than re-rolling wound rolls. Murderous Demise could give your opponent a pretty nasty surprise. Canoptech Reinforcement is pretty nice to get a plasma site exactly where you need it, and the Obsec is very usable if it makes the difference. Overall, a strong section. So overall, I feel like Games Workshop has done pretty well with this Army of Renown. It does genuinely seem that you're making some pretty big trade-offs for this, but you do get some nice benefits as well, and a lot of those are just extra raw damage, which is almost guaranteed to be helpful. I'd say the biggest draw to running them is just all the damage. The traits will help out against certain units, but mainly their stratagems and their Annihilation Protocols seem to be where the real big value's at. The stratagems in general are very nice, as we've just discussed. I do quite like the way that you could make quite a fighty Scorpec Lord if you wanted to. There are plenty of drawbacks, of course. Annihilation Protocols being so limited is a bit sad, and you are skipping out on a whole bunch of the strong choices from the Necron Codex, the Silent King in particular, no Cryptex, a whole load of units missing, and not getting the very easy objectives secured across the entire army that make them so strong on primaries. In general, kind of unusually for a Necron army, they are going to be quite weak on objectives. They don't really have very many chaff units for their actions and things, and they've got limited objectives secured without quite a big investment. I guess the Necron secondaries really are quite easy though, so I still find it unlikely that they're going to be too hard pressed on objectives, at least compared with most armies in the game. Overall, I'd rate them at a pretty solid alternative way to play Necrons. I'd say probably not quite as overall strong as Silent King plus Obsec Dynasty Necrons, which seem to be the default way to play them these days, but I think there's quite a lot of arguments that you can make for this one. They do have some very nice raw damage, and I feel like this is an army list that could be successful at tournaments if people really lent into it, if they did want to try and do well with something different. In any case, let me know what you think of these rules if you are a Necron player. Would you be tempted to run a full-on Destroyer cult as an army? And what do you make of the way that Games Workshop is releasing the rules in White Dwarfs rather than in their supplement books? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k updates coming. I'll certainly cover any other rules changes for the Necrons. It's certainly not impossible we might see other supplements or armies of renown in coming months. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.